Mucci with Arden Media. We're delighted to have over 400 people register for today's event. We're going to get started in just another minute. We can see people coming into the conference right now, so give us a minute. This is Jeff Mucci with Arden Media Company. My role is Head of Industry Insights. We're publisher of RCR Wireless News, Enterprise IoT, and Telecom Careers. Last month, we launched a new publication called In Building Tech. And today's program is the first in a series of editorial programs around in-building technology. Our initial target audience for in-building tech is really twofold. Number one, going after commercial real estate building owners and investors, typically the landlord side of the equation. The second target audience is around targeted corporate real estate executives, typically the tenants in the building or big corporations who own their own buildings. Over time, we'll focus on hospitals and manufacturing and other general buildings, but initially we're really focused on the commercial real estate multi-tenant space. Today's program is titled LP-WAN versus CBRS, DAS, or cellular connectivity for intelligent buildings. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to cover a couple of housekeeping items. Number one, please feel free to submit questions at any given time. Most likely we're going to hold all those questions until the end of the presentation today. But what we found is that there's some really great questions that come through, and our speakers will be monitoring those questions, and as it makes sense, we'll introduce or answer those questions on the call. Secondly, this is being recorded, so all the slides and the recording of this webinar will be shared with all the registration guests after the event. So, in addition to Jason Marcheck, who's the author of our report in today's webinar, we have Sean Kinney, who is Managing Director of Content for Arden Media. He also wears the hat of Editor-in-Chief for RCR Wireless News. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us today.
You bet. It's our pleasure.
So, Jason, today's webinar is generally going to talk about a report that was completed in the last week, and we're going to be publishing it. You maybe want to talk a little bit about some of the key themes that you covered in the report and what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, you bet. So, you know, you can see the agenda slide up there, and really the way we decided to frame this program is to take some of the key points that appear throughout the report, and you can see the cover page of the report on the right of the slide there. Take some of the key themes that we addressed in the report and pull those out and frame them as, you know, we'll call them 5 burning questions or 5 key points, however you'd like to kind of frame that. But really, you know, looking at the state of connectivity in buildings today, and then dive into a little bit deeper into some of the technologies that are being used to connect buildings. What are some of the trends that are, you know, occurring within each one of those technologies? Look at how IoT is driving the need for connectivity. You know, if we think about the Internet of Things or Industry 4.0 and billions of connected devices, most of that's going to be enterprise type applications, and so there's obviously going to be a very tight linkage between, you know, the Internet of Things connectivity and the buildings in which the work is taking place. So we'll try to talk a little bit about that, and then talk about some investment drivers that, you know, the commercial real estate community are evaluating whenever they decide, you know, do I invest in you know, in comprehensive building connectivity, and then maybe even, you know, kind of further down the pecking order in building automation solutions. So those are the, you know, they roughly track the format of the report. Obviously, you know, everybody on the program today can download the report or have access to the report and read through it. But these are our high points, and then, you know, obviously we're going to have some Q&A afterwards. So that's how we're going to structure the program today. And, you know, right before we get started in the meat of the program, the first bullet on the last slide was, who is LAN Bridge? So, you know, we're basically we're here to help create thought leadership and sales enablement for materials that help sales and marketing teams be more effective in their interactions with customers and prospects. I think very much in line with Arden Media's goal of accelerating the buyer journey. And what we do is we try to look at these technologies, be it 5G, IoT, cloud, virtualization, and connect the dots between these technologies and the impact that they're having on vertical industries. I'd say commercial real estate is certainly one of them, and then a lot of the other verticals, Jeff, that you mentioned early on in the program, whether it be oil and gas, healthcare, transportation, autonomous driving, and whatnot. So, but enough about that. I think what we're going to do now is just dive into the meat of the program, and I'd like to get started just by examining, the question of how connected is connected, right? I mean, just about every building in the developed world has some form of wired and probably wireless broadband connectivity. So it is probably a fair question just to step back and say, aren't buildings connected already? And the answer is to an extent, but we kind of put a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek checklist up here. But if your wire closet or your riser looks kind of like the picture on the left, one of the indications there is that we had the previous webinar that we did on this series. One of the stats that we pulled out, and I believe this stat's actually quoted in the report that is going along with this program, is that as much as 40% of copper plant that's in a building today is stranded. And what that means is there's a lot of these wires that have come in over time. Different service providers have kind of hacked together solutions. And then, the unintended consequence is there's a lot of stranded capacity inside a building, or in some cases, a lot of useless capacity. And so, if you have something if your building's a little bit older and have had, a lot of access to the wire closet over years, there's a good chance that maybe some rationalization or upgrades of the physical infrastructure could be necessary. There's another, do your tenants or employees feel like this? I think we're past the point of cell phone users being okay with walking around an office building to look for enough bars to make a phone call, or look for enough bars to get an adequate data connection. And so it really is becoming an attractiveness issue for tenants when they look to rent space. They'll bring their IT manager, and he'll walk around the building and make sure that there's adequate connectivity in all of the nooks and crannies of the building. So if there is a situation where, maybe you're down to one bar in a part of your building, then maybe you do need to, maybe your building isn't connected enough. And then if we take that kind of to its logical conclusion, if we talk about building automation and we talk about the ability to dynamically and proactively control the systems such as HVAC and water supply and lighting, we kind of, a lot of us who work in offices see people who have their sweaters on in the summertime because the building's too cold in one room, maybe it's too hot in the other room. All of these are kind of telltale signs that perhaps your building might be a candidate for an upgraded in-building connectivity solution, and then perhaps down the line a more integrated automation solution. So those are kind of the high-level checklists.
Yep. So Jason, I thought I'd jump in here, maybe take a step back and talk about the trends over the past 3 to 5 years around who's been investing in in-building connectivity up to now, and what are some of the trends. And maybe I'll direct this at Sean, because you've been writing about in-building technology and DAS for a number of years. Who's investing in these systems today, and what are some of the current trends that we're seeing in the marketplace?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question, Jeff. Well, there's a lot of different in-building environments. So we're talking about a very large set of built environments. On one end, you've got stadiums and airports, transportation hubs, and other kinds of marquee venues. And then you've got this segment called the middle prize, which is a building that's somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 square feet. So carriers are always going to invest in in-building systems at these marquee venues like a football stadium, like an airport. It's just not tenable for them to have so many of their customers transit those facilities and not be able to reliably and up to a good quality of service connect to that network. But then for the middle price space, the carriers don't have the capital pool to cover every one of these buildings, and there are lots of them. So this is having an interesting effect of pushing that investment from the carrier over to a building owner or an enterprise stakeholder. And that also has a downstream impact on the vendors of in-building systems. Instead of selling to carriers, they're having to take a hard look at each of these enterprise verticals, at all of this Class A real estate, at hospitals and so forth, and tailor their product suite and their sales approach to better fit this buyer segment.
That's great insight. And again, sorry for interjecting there, Jason, because I think what you're getting ready to go into is, what are some of the benefits of a smarter building? So I'll let you kind of dive back in. But a lot of folks may not be familiar with this dramatic shift that we're seeing today, where the carriers simply aren't going to invest in DAS systems anymore, and that burden then falls on either the building owner or the tenant themselves. And so it drives to this slide here about, what are some of the motivations as to why people would invest in technology?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that to Sean's point with, the sweet spot really being extra large venues, some of the trends that we're going to talk about later on in the program start to get to, that problem of how do you start to outfit the kind of bottom 95% of commercial office buildings out there that aren't a stadium or an airport or an extremely large retail facility. And so there's absolutely a need, I think, to start to put together solutions that can really help this. The middle prize that Sean mentioned, that's a big segment. And so, but I guess the fundamental question becomes, why do you want to, or what's the motivations, as you said, for investing? And it's really twofold. I think that, on one hand, connected buildings are smarter. And what does that mean? It means that they're better able to, facilitate proactive management of, whether it's the HVAC system or it's the lighting system, it's the security access and control system, and ideally all of those systems working in concert. There's some stats right here on the page that I think are pretty powerful. The Energy Information Agency of the United States Energy Information Agency estimates that about 40% of all building operator or operations costs are energy related. And then kind of as a corollary to that, 30% of the energy delivered to most buildings ends up being wasted, whether, and we've talked about it, whether a room's too cold or room's too hot. There's the LED lights are on full blast when they don't need to be, depending on the time of day. And so we're seeing this kind of recognition here that the more automated a building is, actually you can really realize some profound savings right off the bat if you're just able to tune the building to its usage pattern. Then on the other side of the coin, which is a little bit of a softer type of a metric, but something that there's actually a growing body of evidence around, it's that number one, connected employees work better. So, the more connected an employee is, the more productive they are, the more willing they are to collaborate. And then if you kind of take that downstream from the connectivity point of view to the smart building, comfortable employees are also more productive. They're not having the thermostat battles where someone turns the thermostat down, then they go back to their office and somebody else turns it back up again. This, that, and the other thing. So they actually spend less time worrying about this and more time on the job that they're hired to do. And so there is actually a growing body of evidence by a number of research groups that show that there is a real monetary case to be made for, number one, connecting a building so that there is seamless and ubiquitous connectivity, but also so that, you can make these buildings smarter, more automated, and more conducive to, what they're being rented to accomplish.
And Jason, this is a great slide. I think the picture on the right speaks directly to the co-working spaces, the WeWorks of the world, that are hubs of creativity and productivity, and certainly the valuation of WeWork speaks directly to the popularity of WeWork environments. But one of the comments I heard this week while meeting with a large global commercial real estate company was that one of the key words that the commercial real estate guys are using is densification. And I kind of chuckled because we've been using the word densification around densifying networks and cities, et cetera, for the last 4 to 5 years. And in the context that they used it in, it was densification of people per square foot in a building.
Mm-hmm.
And, 5 years ago, the density was, say, one person for every 300 square feet. And now that number is dropping to one person for every 75 to 150 square feet. And he said, people don't realize that means there's actually less oxygen in the building. There's more traffic and on the elevators. There's more and more weight in the elevators. There's more heat being generated in the building, which has a profound impact on these office buildings and the existing HVAC, the existing lighting, the existing elevator loads, et cetera. And I thought that was just a really interesting point, that here we are in the communications industry talking about densification, and we enter a whole new sector called commercial real estate building owners, and they're talking about densification in a completely different way. And it speaks to your point on the left.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the interesting aspects of that is, the reason people are densifying is companies are looking to save money on rent per square foot, right? But all of the things that you mentioned then actually become productivity inhibitors if you don't properly manage the space that people are working in and keep them comfortable and keep them connected and keep, all of those square footage that you're renting uniformly lit and things of that nature. So there is a delicate balance between saving money on square footage of your rent and then also losing productivity because you're cramming people in and they're uncomfortable and they can't get a data signal. So it's a delicate balance, but it really does speak to, the need as buildings are becoming, as they're densifying and WeWork spaces become more popular. The case for building connectivity and automation really becomes a lot more profound.
Jason, another key point you just mentioned is, I think Sean mentioned 4 bars. One of the basic needs of a better connectivity is people need to use their phones. And I was in a meeting this week again with the commercial real estate folks, and one of the property managers was pretty savvy, and he said, the tenants, the building investors were saying, wait a minute, we get 4 bars, they have great connectivity. So maybe can you touch on, or Sean jump in, one of you two jump in on, does 5 bars mean you have good connectivity and have good data throughput?
Not necessarily. You might get this. The bars, as I understand it, refers to the signal strength, and there could be plenty of RF flowing through the building, but not enough capacity, on that spectrum. And so there's plenty of times when you could have seemingly an adequate number of bars, but you still can't get a data connection because the capacity in that sector or whatever is not up to speed. So there is, I definitely think there's a calculation that has to go into it.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so I guess we kind of made the case for connectivity. And so then now the question becomes, how do you best connect? And, I think the answer to that question really depends on a myriad of factors. I think you're looking at a building size, you're looking at its age, its design, its location. You're looking at the existing technology that is in the building now vis-a-vis what you might have to install. And then you're going to look at use cases. Is it being used as a call center, or is it being used as an R&D facility for highly secure drug development? So there are probably about as many design choices as there are buildings in a number of ways. And so I think the key takeaway for me is that, there's never going to be a one size fits all, but you do need the right plumbing, right? You do have to have a proper infrastructure that goes throughout the building that can get the job done, whatever that job might have to be. And then on the other side of the coin, you need that spigot, right? You're going to, as we just mentioned, you need to make sure that people can connect. And when they do connect, the data is flowing and they can make a call and they can use the connectivity in the way that makes them most productive. And so here's a slide that kind of starts to think about, the options that folks have on the table. And I think that, DAS is definitely, kind of the name that a lot of folks know. That's the communications infrastructure for the large buildings. And it's a very, it's kind of a mature ecosystem. But, we see some of these, millimeter wave, and in that picture down below there is a C-Spire example. 5G might actually be a way of coming in and providing some of this connectivity without the need for a big DAS system. And so there's a lot of options on the table right now. And one of the things that I might like to ask Sean is, because I know he follows it so closely, is that how much of an impact could 5G have on, kind of in-building connectivity from a real high-grade enterprise perspective? I've seen announcements from Verizon on using 5G in select use cases as maybe a fixed broadband alternative, and you see the Huawei millimeter wave gear there that's designed for capacity in very tight spaces, and you see the C-Spire picture there, which obviously seems like a large portal going into an office building. So is there are there things that you're seeing that kind of indicate that 5G could be something that makes an impact on the in-building space?
Yeah, that's not something that's talked about a lot right now, but I think you can look at what some of the action that we're seeing in the near future and then kind of look forward and interpret maybe what we'll see next. So you mentioned Verizon. So Verizon is using some of their millimeter wave frequency to stand up a fixed wireless access broadband service in 4 markets by the end of this year. Right now, their focus is on residential, but there's not to say that you couldn't just as easily take that radio node, take that CPE, and set up a small business for a gigabit connection. To add a little bit more color to that, AT&T is planning a standards-compliant mobile 5G deployment this year in 12 markets, and that comes on the heels of about 2 years of field trials, the very first of which took place right in Austin, where Arden Media is based, and they were essentially using their millimeter wave spectrum to provide enhanced mobile broadband right around a gigabit to small and medium-sized businesses. So one of those examples was a dentist office there in Austin, where they set up kind of a immersive media experience, kind of maybe take your mind off of what's about to happen in the dentist chair. So I think there really is an opportunity to use millimeter wave to provide in-building connectivity, but I don't really think that's going to turn out to be the right solution for some of these large facilities. And it's also important to remember that millimeter wave has challenging propagation characteristics that are not at all helped by low E glass that is so common on some of these modern office buildings.
Yeah. Jason, another point that you talk about plumbing, the right plumbing. One of the themes we heard at our launch event in Dallas from 2 building engineers, chief building engineers, each of whom manage, 1 million square foot plus commercial office buildings, was for them, it all starts with the fiber backbone in the building. And that is the right, having glass and the right bones up the riser is point number 1, regardless of what connectivity you use for Wi-Fi or repeaters or for DAS or whatever the case may be. It all starts with fiber.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's a few slides going on that we'll really touch on that. But I think that if you're, if you think about a demand inhibitor for some of these investments, it is, how do I make sure that an investment I make today is going to be still relevant 5 years from now? In the tech industry, there's always a next G coming down the road. So, I mean, we're just starting to talk about, real hard 5G type deployments, maybe starting at the end of this year. It can't be long before we're going to be starting to talk about, what happens after 5G. Well, if you're a building owner, you want to make sure that, that's in your mind, and there's a big price tag associated with a lot of these things. So fiber is absolutely a way of protecting investment and making sure that regardless of what comes in the future, as far as, higher bandwidth, more capacity, use cases that use even more data than the use cases today, fiber is going to be the way to support all those, regardless of how things ultimately end up developing. And so I think that there's a really good reason to put fiber in a building if you have the opportunity to do it. But of course, there's also other things. There's CBRS. Talking about the ability to maybe overcome some cost issues that are associated with DAS. And then there's also, if you are in a dense IoT environment, then some of the low power WAN type technologies are also probably an arrow in the quiver. And all of these things I think are worth diving into. So we'll talk about a little more of each of those in the next couple slides here. But one of the first things I think we ought to talk about is DAS, because it is kind of the big dog in the in-building connectivity porch, if you will. It is a relatively mature technology. It has a well-defined ecosystem of suppliers and neutral host type, folks that'll sign up operators. It has a big ecosystem of consultants and integrators that can help a building owner make intelligent decisions about, what they're about to spend money on, and how to best install that into their building. And so it is, an ecosystem that has a lot of support for a building owner that's looking to have a lot of questions answered. I think it's flexible in the way that it can support a range of technologies, be it Wi-Fi, cellular, Ethernet, a lot of other things. It can be served by a variety of carriers. And, it's relatively flexible, at least on the endpoints, as far as how things get deployed. I know CRAN, centralized RAN, is a big trend that's going on in the DAS space right now. And now we're also seeing the use of licensed versus unlicensed and even shared spectrum schemes. And so if you are looking at a DAS system, or if you think a DAS system is right for you, one of the good things is that it is a technology that a lot of companies have a lot of experience doing, and there are a lot of deployment options that are at their disposal. So I think that, that's, I don't know if Jeff or Sean, you have anything to add to that, but it's certainly, we hear a lot of talk about, is something going to be a DAS killer? Is this going to be a DAS killer? Is that going to be a DAS killer? My personal feeling is that it's going to be very difficult to find a true DAS killer out there, because it's just a solution that was really built for the problem it's trying to solve.
Yeah, I'll weigh in on something there, Jason. You mentioned centralized RAN. This is a model that's being used to streamline time to deployment and also take out some of the cost and complexity. You look a little bit past that, we're also seeing virtualization of the RAN infrastructure along with the centralization. So you're able to serve up multiple facilities from one baseband pool, where instead of these big expensive proprietary boxes, you're running virtualized functions on commercial off-the-shelf hardware. So this is a little more IT friendly, a little more CapEx friendly, and certainly a little easier to operate. All that said, it's a relatively nascent space, and there's a lot of work going on in the operator community to kind of generate some consensus around open interoperability standards. You see that with the XRAN Forum, the ORAN Alliance, and all of their membership. So to say that the virtualized RAN is a good solution for an enterprise buyer, I don't know if that's necessarily accurate, but I think over time we will see a lot of adoption of that.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, and by the way, one of the things I heard here in Dallas this week is one of the high-rise buildings downtown. Granted, it's an older building. It's owned by an investor who doesn't want to spend a nickel in improving the building. They basically installed a series of repeaters just to improve connectivity, right? So I know we're not going to get into repeaters today, but repeaters seem to have their place in the market as well.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the all hands on deck type of approach. There's not necessarily a silver bullet. There's a lot of things you can do, and a lot of them are appropriate depending on the philosophy of the building owner, or like I said, the use case, or a lot of other factors. And so that's why I think it is important to keep an open mind and make sure that if you are a building owner, you're aware of all these arrows that you have in the proverbial quiver. And I think, that's a nice segue into this slide here, because one of the big things that's on the cusp of really becoming a commercial reality is CBRS. And so, when you think of CBRS, it's probably not, it's not nearly as mature as maybe the DAS ecosystem, but it does have a lot of support. The CBRS Alliance has hundreds of members. The FCC is gotten involved, and they're about to really approve spectrum licenses in the 3.5 gigahertz band. The CBRS Alliance offers certification and training programs, which is really important to speeding time to delivery and making sure that when you do, contract with someone, they come in with a good idea of what they're supposed to be doing. The nice thing is it does include all of these various suppliers that have to come together and work together to make a system or make a solution, as elegant as it needs to be. We mentioned shared spectrum and licensed and unlicensed. In an in-building situation, a lot of these guys are dealing with, you're talking about an AT&T with, billions and billions of CapEx dollars. A lot of building owners don't have billions and billions of dollars to invest in their buildings, right? And so licensed spectrum becomes perhaps a material inhibitor to be able to do that. At the same time, if you're relying on unlicensed spectrum, there's a lot of interference issues. There's not as much security, all of the things that come into play. So the idea behind CBRS is there's kind of a hybrid model where you kind of lightly licensed spectrum is, I think, the nomenclature that they're using. And so there is some element of a licensed, sort of dedicated use case for the spectrum, but it also has the opportunity to leverage some unlicensed spectrum where it makes sense, where the use cases make sense.
Yep. And so Jason, we've been writing about CBRS for a long time, but a lot of folks on this call may not be familiar with the technology in RF. So maybe, Sean, you could give us a little background on what CBRS is, the players, and kind of the big trends there.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, 3.5 gigahertz band. This is a great spectrum for a long time. It's been used by some fixed satellite operators, the Department of Defense, some other radar type functionality. The FCC has been looking to open this up for mobile services, and in this case, what's under consideration is a 3-tiered spectrum access sharing mechanism that would protect the incumbent users, grant licensure to priority access users, and then keep down at the bottom of the pyramid general authorized access for everybody else. So kind of the open questions in front of the FCC right now are licensure term and the geographic size of the areas that the license could cover. So there's a lot of excitement around this in that it could potentially open up wireless services to a lot of market entrants that are not carriers. So, naturally you kind of think cable companies and other kind of service providers that don't play specifically in mobility. But then you also think about large enterprises, large industrial players, where they could actually acquire their own spectrum and run a private LTE network for their own users, which would have a lot of benefits with it. In the context of a building, you could conceive of a scenario where a building owner could essentially stand up their own private LTE network and to some extent serve as a neutral host and really monetize that service. That's somewhat of a speculative use case, but I think pending what happens on the regulatory front, something that certainly might play out to some degree. And recently the CBRS Alliance put together a deployment and operations working group, and the general thinking is that we're going to see some commercial deployments in Q4 this year. So we should see some pretty rapid developments throughout 2018.
And will those developments be targeting in-building connectivity, or will they be something entirely different?
Yeah, I think that this is an in-building play. To give you an example, based on some of the trial activity we're seeing, Boingo Wireless, which is very active in the CBRS Alliance, is currently conducting a trial at Love Field there in Dallas, where they have stood up a private LTE network for the airport's IT department, which is, I think, about 24 users, and they have some mobile devices and some laptops outfitted with dongles, and they're using that for their own communication. So obviously, something that can scale to a large venue and support multiple users in an in-building environment.
And what's the channel been? How wide are those channels within CBRS, and will they support heavy data loads?
Yeah, Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we're talking about a 150 megahertz channel width that's going to be up for grabs. So this can certainly support a pretty broad range of data load.
Yep, absolutely.
Good. Thank you for that. And the big players you mentioned, I know we've talked internally about Federated Wireless, Google. Who are some of what's the term, the acronym for the platform folks that are looking at this space as a new business opportunity?
Oh, I think you're talking about OnGo, O-N-G-O, which is sort of a brand name for a commercialized CBRS product. So CBRS Alliance developed a certification process that will, label OnGo devices as compliant with all of the standards and specifications that go along with CBRS.
Got it. Thank you.
All right. So moving along, and then we kind of mentioned DAS and CBRS, and one of the things that is going to become an increasingly large portion of the pie is how you support IoT within a building. And then I think that's where LP-WAN really comes into play. And some of the benefits obviously are it's a purpose-built technology, really, designed largely to support IoT type applications. And obviously IoT is going to be super critical to, it's going to be extremely important for intelligent buildings to support IoT going forward, not only for some of the automation systems that we mentioned earlier, but also for just the business models of the tenants that occupy the buildings. Some of the advantages, it's a proprietary technology, so that's sometimes in the telecom world that carries a bad connotation, but I think in this sense it can be a good thing because number one, it uses unlicensed spectrum, so it gets it gets around some of the cost issues that we talked about, but it also allows for very bespoke type implementations. So if you can kind of dream it up, you're probably going to find a LoRa Alliance partner that's going to be able to deploy that for you. And I think that is important because as we start to think about IoT and all of the use cases, a lot of these use cases, there's general factory automation use cases, but then within that, you're going to have hundreds and hundreds of different applications. And deployment scenarios, and so the ability to really use unlicensed spectrum in a malleable type of a deployment scenario, I think is something that really plays in the favor of LP-WAN, and definitely is something that it's a reason why it has a seat at the table here, and it's something that we should be talking about. We're kind of running up on the time where we should be answering questions, so I do want to get into the key trends area. And in some ways, it's almost like Sean saw these slides in advance because some of the things he had mentioned with respect to virtualization and with respect to centralized RAN and Jeff with the fiber-centric architecture, those are all things that are absolutely going on right now and all things that I think are going to play a big role in how DAS systems get deployed in the future. And I think Sean did a nice job of talking about CRAN, so I probably won't go into too much detail there. But one of the things that you mentioned, Sean, was virtualization, and how applicable is it going to be to have kind of white box hardware? How far down the road does that get you as far as agility and scalability and deployment flexibility? And I think that there is a case to be made here. I think that if you start to think about a DAS system, being in a building that's a multi-tenant environment, these are dynamic type spaces. Tenants move in, tenants move out, and some of them have more employees than the other ones. Sometimes you might want to subdivide that space up, and then as we mentioned before, co-working and the ability to cover every square inch of a floor. Once you start to think about moving to just kind of like white box hardware with software, then it really becomes easy, low cost to switch out facilities if you need to put a little, a small cell, and then pull that out. You're not spending a lot of money on the hardware in the first place. And then, one of the big benefits of virtualization is the ability to kind of turn up and spin down, scale in and scale out resources on an automated and hopefully in the future closed loop fashion. So whenever you do have new service requests from a tenant in one part of the building, you can respond to that request in days, hours, minutes, as opposed to weeks and months, which is kind of the case now. So I think virtualization could play actually a pretty big role in the in-building in the in-building market. in the real near future. And I think that even to take that a step further, you're starting to see a lot of the operators offer SD-WAN type services. That's actually going to drive use, I think, for in-building connectivity, because as enterprises become more flexible in the resources that they consume and use, then obviously the infrastructure that's in the building that's required to deliver those services is going to have to be at least as malleable. So I think there is a lot to be said on the virtualization front in building.
That's a great slide. We're not going to solve it today, but precisely the reason why some of the building investors don't want to invest in technology, because they don't want to be invested in something that's going to be obsolete in 2 years. But let's keep rolling, and because you've got some great slides coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. So key trends in CBRS, and we talked a lot about Ongo. That is, in my opinion, one of the big value adds that the CBRS Alliance brings. When you're talking about a nascent technology, the ability to point to a certification program, the ability to point to products that are going to be developed, to a product development schedule. I think that those are all of the things that Ongo brings to the table, and that in turn brings a lot of predictability to the ecosystem, and it also with predictability becomes confidence. So to Jeff, to your point about investment protection, I think what the CBRS Alliance is doing with Ongo is trying to overcome a lot of those objections that kind of hamstring a new technology in the early days, and so I think that that's going to be a pretty big deal. And then obviously the spectrum license process is going to be huge. We are really right in the cusp of that, and I think that there's announcements forthcoming in the next couple of weeks, and so it's one of those kind of sit tight, stay tuned type of things. But we're going to see a lot of momentum, I think, in the fourth quarter. To Sean's point on deployments, and a lot of that has the groundwork has been set with all the work that the FCC has been doing over the last couple of years in conjunction with the CBRS Alliance. So I don't know, guys, if you have anything to add here. I think we covered CBRS pretty well, but I certainly don't want to leave out anything that if there's a point you guys want to make.
I'm going to hold the question later, but in the open Q&A, let's talk about interference. We had a question from an attendee about interference. Let's hold that till we get to the end.
Gotcha. Absolutely. And so some burning trends or some key trends in the LP-WAN market. IT-powered business transformation or IoT-powered business transformation, I think, is going to be really, really key. Almost every player in every industry has someone working for them that is assessing the impact of IoT and what it could have on their industry and on their business. And I think the reason for that is because it's going to kind of have comprehensive impact across the board. And so, as I mentioned before, if we are thinking about building automation, number one, but also just the way IoT is going to kind of permeate the business cases of companies in specific industries, having structures, having commercial real estate facilities that are capable of supporting this is really paramount. And so that's going to drive a lot of interest, I would say, in LP-WAN. Again, we have a pretty good ecosystem here, especially with what Semtech's doing with the Cellular Alliance. There's over 500 members. Not all of this is in building, so admittedly, this is not a technology that's specific to in building. But there's a lot of operators. There's deployments in almost 100 countries at the end of 2017. So it is an ecosystem where there are a lot of players and a lot of deployments kind of history.
Hey,
and then
Jason, could I jump in real quick on this IoT point? I'm going to have to refer everyone back to that slide that showed all of the different sort of in-building applications that can ride off of connectivity, security, HVAC monitoring, cameras, point of sale, all of this kind of stuff. These are all, accurately described as IoT use cases. I just want to make the point that, what you want out of an IoT implementation is to either save money through efficiency or create a new revenue stream that makes you money. As it relates to a smart building, if you're the building owner that's investing in this, you can effectively do both of those things. you can save yourself operating cost as it relates to the management of your building systems, and you can charge your tenants a premium because they have this connected, very usable, very friendly work environment. So, you know, this really is a great proposition as it relates to IoT in the in-building environment.
100%. Yep. I think there's no question about that. We might even touch on that in a little bit, you know, in a few slides. But I think the segue from what you just said into, you know, IoT, your point of there has to be a reason, you know, for this. And a lot of times us, you know, guys like us, we like to talk about technology, and it ends up being technology for technology's sake, right? And so IoT is very much can fall into that trap. I think the little picture on the left of that slide, of this slide right here, can point to that trap, right? You know, IoT has the opportunity to really profoundly change the way work is done. And one of the ways it's going to do that is it's going to generate a lot of data that is going to feed artificial intelligence engines. In turn, these artificial intelligence engines are going to basically allow a lot of closed loop automation to occur, where things are being tuned, things are being optimized, processes are being done and accomplished, and work's getting done really without the need of human intervention. And so on one hand, I think, you know, the point is that companies are going to have to embrace this. They're going to have to figure out how to use it, and they're going to need facilities that are capable of handling these demands. But then the danger becomes, are we talking in circles here? Because how do you actually take a lot of this stuff and manage it and make money off of it? And that goes into the next slide. And that kind of, I think, points back, Sean, to what you were saying, is that, you know, intelligent buildings, they save operating costs. You know, you can dramatically, materially cut your energy costs. You can dramatically cut the costs that you have to spend on security personnel. You know, you can do a whole number of things that are going to really quickly bear out an ROI case. I think we talked about the fact that connected employees are more productive. And, you know, so building automation also makes employees more productive because they're more productive, or they're more comfortable, and they're able to focus on the job at hand. Now, how does that, you know, translate into, you know, a building owner increasing their net operating income? I think there's a couple things, and that kind of points, really the macro point, I would say, is the background of this slide, and that's competitiveness, right? We are in a situation now where more and more companies are digital native. More and more companies are being founded to really help businesses do business in the cloud, do business, you know, in an IoT environment, do business in a 5G environment, do business in a digital marketplace. And so these high-tech employers demand high-tech workspaces. So if they don't have, you know, the access to the technologies that they need to do their jobs, then they're quite frankly just not going to rent spaces in those buildings. And so I think it becomes a fundamental competitiveness issue for commercial real estate investors to make sure that their buildings are competitive, to become attractive to these, you know, to these types of employers. And then in turn, to Sean's point, you can charge a premium for that. Then I think we've discussed some things with respect to smart buildings and co-working and open floor plans, and then the fiber. And I think that maybe Jeff or Sean wants to interject here, so I'll let them do that. But the point is, you know, I think it really reinforces what Sean said, is that, you know, by investing in some of these technologies, you really have the opportunity to kind of enjoy a double benefit of not only, you know, saving ROI for yourself and your tenants, but also making your spaces much more attractive and competitive.
Yeah, I can't really overstate it, but just real briefly, you know, connectivity and everything that comes with it. If you're a building owner, this is key to attracting and retaining tenants and to driving up your lease rates. And, you know, just anecdotally, based on some of the conversations I've had with in-building vendors, we're actually getting to a point where you're seeing service level requirements built in to commercial leases. So, you know, this is really kind of quickly going from something that you really ought to invest into something that you are quite literally going to have to invest in as a function of lease agreements. So just can't stress that enough.
Absolutely.
Well, I'll jump in here, and it's we've been focused on this commercial real estate market now for 3 or 4 months, and I've been involved in meetings with the technology sellers, the vendors, like you said, Sean, and we sometimes tend to talk about technology for technology's sake. But of late, I've gone out and talked to commercial building owners and the property managers of investor-owned properties, and I can tell you that they don't see the same world. They don't see the world in the same way that we've been talking about it. And this week, I met with one of the world's largest managers of commercial real estate. They manage that property for, on one end of the spectrum, the Googles of the world and the Nikes of the world and the WeWorks of the world, who are all about the experience and the tenancy, et cetera. So that's really facilities management for a corporate-owned facility where they want the high touch and they're willing to make the investment. On the exact other end of the spectrum are the investors of multi-tenant office buildings who, once they sign a lease with a tenant, I say this, but it's the words that I'm hearing, that they don't care about whether the tenant has connectivity, because they just signed a 5-year lease. They gave the tenant allowance. The tenant used that allowance to put walls and carpet and nice lights in the building, and the building investor has fulfilled their obligations to that tenant for the next 5 years. And so on the far other end of the spectrum, you have investors who are, number one, they're not technology savvy, and number two, once they sign a lease, they fulfilled their obligation. And so then the burden falls on that individual tenant as to how they're going to improve connectivity in the building. And when it comes to the thermostat, they're just going to keep calling the building management to come open up the thermostat and increase the temperature. But that request from the tenant is going to fall on deaf ears. So I'm just saying there's two ends of the spectrum. And when we opened this call, we talked about the closing the gap between the tenants and the landlords. Within landlords, you really got tenants or companies that own the building. So they're the landlord for the employees, and they're going to be all about high touch investment and all this sort of thing and the experience. But on the other end, you've got building investors who are there to drive a return on the investment, which means spend as little on the building as they can. And so it really is a challenging environment. And the key point I'll make here is, for the technology sellers, whether you're a vendor of antennas or DAS systems or CBRS, or you're the building management system seller, you're swimming against a strong current and running into a strong headwind, and to people who simply don't know much about technology and are all bottom line driven, who may be, their investment cycle might be, I'm going to buy this building for 3 years, then I'm going to flip it, and I'm not going to invest in technology. So the message to the technology sellers and the people on this call are, you got to look at every single building as an individual case-by-case basis. Every building is different. It has a different occupier, and it has a different configuration, it has a different investor. And for technology sellers, that makes life very difficult, because it means coming up with a custom solution for every single building out there. One size does not fit all. Does that make sense?
I think it's 100% true that, what you said, as far as, I think it's all 100% true. One thing when you were talking, one of the things that it kind of reminded me of is sort of the early days of network virtualization in the tech space. There's a lot of things you can do with it, but getting the guy to write the check for it was a really difficult proposition. And you had people talking about, those cycles being the same as IP, right? Maybe 20 years before we were really, really talking about meaningful virtualization deployments. That's proved to be, now we're 3 or 4 years into that, and almost every network operator, service provider is hip deep in, how do I virtualize my network? How do I get on board with this wave? And I think there's perhaps a corollary there. I do agree that there are plenty of building owners out there, for good reasons, that might not be interested in big, expensive, hard to manage, hard to understand automation and connectivity solutions. But I do think that we're going to see kind of the cycles of tenants becoming more and more and more savvy and aware and demanding these things. I think that's going to accelerate that attitude that you really, maybe you might not want to, but you're going to have to figure out a way of investing in these things.
Well, that's a great comment. When I said that basically the same thing you said, that the comment I heard back was, Jeff, age and time will solve this. I said, what do you mean? They said, well, it's the age of the investors. So some of these asset managers are in their 50s and or older in years, and they're going to retire, and they're going to be replaced by more technology savvy asset managers and fund managers. So we'll have a different perspective. So age will take care of that, but also time. Some of these buildings that have, where they haven't invested in the HVAC system, or they haven't invested in the lighting system, or they haven't invested in the roof, at some point that system is going to collapse, whether it be the chiller or the roof, unfortunately, or the parking garage falls down because the investor didn't invest in it at that point in time. And so the time element will come to play. Whether that's 2 years or 10 years from now, the investor is going to be forced to invest in new elevator systems, new HVAC systems, new lighting systems. And the interesting thing, all the vendors at that point will be introducing IoT-enabled, sensor-enabled, big data-enabled systems. So age of the portfolio managers and time, in terms of buildings are decaying, you're going to get new systems in there, but it is going to just take, as you said, Jason, time.
Absolutely.
So we got a few minutes for questions. I know one of the audience questions that came in was with CBRS. It's a shared spectrum, and so you've got military and other folks who are using the spectrum. How CBRS Alliance addressing the risk of interference?
I will probably defer to Sean on that because I know he's been a lot closer to it. But one of the just very quick high-level comments I will make is that's really one of the reasons, at least in the United States, that the FCC has been so heavily involved, and it has been a couple-year process. This isn't something that's come together necessarily quickly, and there has been a couple years of comments and deliberations and whatnot to solve that very issue, because one of the primary use cases for CBRS is public safety. So if we're going to create this band and kind of use it for public safety, but also open it up to commercial use cases, we have to nail that down. And so I think that I don't know the specifics per se, and maybe I'll ask Sean if he knows any, but I do think that there has been conspicuous effort to make sure that they solve that problem.
Okay, sure. Well, Jason's absolutely right. The CBRS sharing has been the subject of extensive regulatory review with the FCC, the industry, and every other conceivable stakeholder. As it relates to CBRS interfering with Wi-Fi, I think that's been pretty well sorted out. I don't think you're going to see any issue there. In terms of the different types of users interfering with one another, I think it's really important to remember that a lot of the incumbent activity that's going to be protected there is very, very specialized and very, very geographically narrow. Also, to that geography point, what the FCC is considering right now are whether to assign these licenses to a partial economic area or based on the census tracts that come out of the every 10-year census. So again, you have these real strict geographic limitations to the access from the different tiers of users, which goes a long ways towards minimizing the opportunity for interference.
That's a great response. Real quick, we'll close out with a question. How do DAS and CBRS work together? Can they work together?
So yeah, I think I don't think there's necessarily a situation that prevents it. I do think if you're thinking about a DAS system, then you're probably talking about Wi-Fi, and you're probably talking about bringing in a neutral host or a carrier. So that's, necessarily going to be licensed spectrum. My understanding of the CBRS use case is it's really to kind of sidestep that, to get around all that types of hurdles and allow, perhaps even like Sean said, enterprises to take control of their own destiny and build their own network. So I don't think there's necessarily there's not necessarily anything that keeps them from being used in tandem. I don't necessarily think it's an either to kind of give a very vague answer, but I do think that if you're frustrated with maybe the cost of a DAS system and you're looking at CBRS, you're probably looking at it as a way of maybe getting around some of the cost that's associated with DAS, especially as it pertains to some of this, these mid-sized office buildings.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that too, Jeff. I know we're slightly over, so I'll be brief, but I'll refer again to that CBRS trial at Love Field, right? This is a big major airport in a metropolitan city. It's clearly got a 4-carrier DAS in it to support all that data traffic. Also got a Wi-Fi system in it to let people log in. So they also have this CBRS that they're using, and that's just used by the IT department. So it's just a private LTE network that is right there alongside all those other networks. So I think, given the bandwidth demands and the complexity of what we're seeing in building networks, I think there's certainly a place for both of them.
We are out of time. Jason, last word?
I'd just like to, I know we're over time, so I'd like to thank everybody for participation. I know there's a bunch of good questions, and we'll try to get back to you guys offline if we didn't get to answer your question live, but I thought it was a great discussion. I appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Well, thank you, Jason. Remember, this report will be published today. Our team is going to be sending it out to all the people who register for this event. The recording and the slides associated with this program will be distributed to everyone who registered. If you do have questions, please feel free to give Jason a call or send him an email. I think we got another slide up here that has Sean's contact information at skinney@Arden Media, or certainly feel free to send me an email at jmucci@Arden Media. Thank you so much for your time, gentlemen.
You bet. Thank you.
All right, have a great day.